surge sea lift. But let's get back to the question that was raised by Subbrief. Is an attack on, or should the Ark integrity be considered a fair target for attack by the Russians? Now, let's be clear. The Russians have been pretty brazen in their attacks. There's a story from just the other day on Maritime Executive. 2 Turkish cargo ships hit by possible missile in Ukraine. Vessels that have been owned by NATO allies have been hit repeatedly during this conflict. An Estonian-owned vessel was sunk, the Helt. Multiple vessels of Turkey and other UN nations and other NATO nations have been hit. Mines have been discovered in the waters of Bulgaria, Romania, and Turkey. However, what has not happened is, while ownership of the vessels is clear, the registration is different. In the case of these 2 vessels, they're not Turkish flag vessels. They're flagged on the island of Vanuatu, which you may know if you watch any episode of Survivor, but this is an island in the middle of the Pacific, and Vanuatu is basically just an open registry flag. And so these vessels are being attacked because, to tell you the truth, the Russians could care less whether Vanuatu, Bangladesh, Panama, the Marshall Islands, or any of these open registry countries do anything about them. And we've seen these attacks take place. They have not triggered any response from anyone at this point. We haven't seen NATO go into the Black Sea. We haven't seen convoys escorting out vessels from Ukraine. The ships sailing from Ukraine right now sail individually on a set path, but with no protection or escort by naval vessels. And so the question becomes, can Russia attack the Ark integrity as it's sailing across the Atlantic to the Europe? Well, take your example from 106 years ago, on this day in history, when Germans unleashed U-boats. On January 31st of 1970, Germany announces the renewal of unrestricted submarine warfare in the Atlantic as German torpedo-armed submarines prepare to attack any and all ships, including passenger carriers said to be sighted in the war zone. This was the beginning of what eventually becomes American entrance into World War I. The Germans declared an area around Europe, particularly around the British Isles, as an area of unrestricted submarine warfare. The Russians would have to do the same, and it's very doubtful the Russians would ever do that, obviously, because not only would an attack on a ship like Ark Integrity be much more brazen, it is outside the boundaries of Ukrainian waters and Ukrainian territory. This would be out in open international waters or in territorial waters of another nation. But it would be an attack on a U.S. flag vessel. And while Ark Integrity was built in Korea and owned by a company in the United States, that's parent company is headquartered back in Europe, it is still an American flagged vessel. If you want to go into this a little bit more, I recommend Rodney Carlisle's Sovereignty at Sea, U.S. Merchant Ships and American Entry into World War I, in an excellent analysis of how the attack on U.S. merchant ships led up to our entry into World War I. And any attack on U.S. shipping would be a direct attack against the United States, would require U.S. immediate retaliation. Now, Ark Integrity is sailing across the Atlantic unescorted. At least no surface vessels are with it. Is she being monitored? Probably satellite tracked, maybe submarine tracked, probably being tracked in many other ways. Her AIS is squawking so you can get the satellite transponder on them, but there is no vessel that's escorting her across the Atlantic. Because, again, she's carrying 60 Bradley fighting vehicles, but the heart of her cargo is commercial shipping cargo. That's a very small portion of this. And, again, we're seeing U.S. ships repeatedly going to and from the United States and Europe, doing routine rotation of American forces, brigade units, battalion units, reinforcements sending over, military aid being sent over. John Conrad over in G Captain, I mentioned this in my What the Ship episode this week, talked about this issue of sea blindness, where we're fixated on Russian oil caps, the Russian ghost fleet of tankers. We're focused on Ukrainian grain ships coming out, but we're not paying attention to U.S. flag vessels delivering military aid over to our allies in Europe in this time, and how essential it is to have U.S. flag vessels doing this. And I think this is a prime example about this too. So go back to Aaron at Subbrief's answer. Yes, this would be an act of war should Russia do it. There's no question about it. Now, would Russia do it? Who knows? No one can figure out what Vladimir Putin's going to do. Hope you enjoyed today's episode.